room. I'm Dr. Greg Wilson here at Texas Tech University. This is my 4th year here at Texas Tech. I'm an assistant professor, and I'm going to be talking about not a specific research project that I'm working on now for 15 or 30 minutes or whatever, but I want to go back and talk about kind of my trajectory, my research trajectory, what I'm working on now and where that came from. So I'm going to talk about some things briefly that I'm currently thinking about, and then backtrack and talk about all the failures and accidents and successes that brought me towards that, and then maybe pick up on those themes again. But I'm going up for tenure this year, and one of the things you have to do when you're going up for tenure is you have to write a summary of who you are as a researcher for people up the chain, up in the dean's office and the provost's office and the president's office, and say, here's what I do. And so no matter what you thought at some point when you were in graduate school, here's the kind of scholar I'm going to be, here's what I'm going to study, here's what's important to me. You know, some number of years later, you have to look back and say, well, here's where I wound up, right? And I'm kind of an unusual case because I finished my PhD in 2001, and I've done a lot of things since then, but going up for tenure now, that's what, 16 years later? So I've got a farther view backwards trying to explain, well, who is it that I am at this point, 16 years into my career going up for tenure? And what kind of scholar have I become regardless of what I thought I was doing at any point in that. So when I was explaining in my tenure packet what it is that I think I do, or trying to look back at the things I published and say, here's a way to make sense of that. The story I told had 3 parts. And I said, I'm interested in how communities solve technical problems. I'm going to wait to explain what I mean by that in a few minutes. So I told them I'm interested in how communities solve technical problems. I'm interested in how people make unpopular arguments, which is a vague sort of thing which means something specific that I'll get to. And I'm interested in how we educate technical communicators for the workplace. This is probably the oddest of those 3 things. I don't think of myself as a pedagogy person. Looking back at my CV, I have written several things about pedagogy, the TC classroom, preparing pedagogy or preparing technical communicators for the workplace, and then what sort of identities do they have in the workplace. I've probably written more about that than I've written about other things. I don't know why. Well, I do know why, because those things intersect with a set of ideas that I'm interested in. So I'm going to be making notes to myself as I work here, because I want to come back and talk about methods. You mentioned methods. I want to come back and talk about ideas. And so from here, I'm moving forward into some projects where I'm thinking about the rhetoric of photography. This makes sense to me in a way hopefully I'll have time to talk about. But that, again, looks like a departure from these questions here. Going back to way before this, how do I start on a trajectory to get to those ideas where I'm explaining to my dean and my provost and the president of the university and the board of trustees that that's who I am as a scholar. As an undergraduate, I had a bachelor's in psychology with an English minor. I didn't think that I would ever wind up as an English professor. Probably the last thing I thought I would do. I read painfully slowly, so I took mostly I got my minor in English taking classes in 20th century American poetry. I didn't want to take those classes where you read 14 Victorian novels. I couldn't do that, so I didn't do that. I was afraid of Virginia Woolf. So anyway, but I worked with student publications in high school and in college. And after I got out of college, I had a job as a salesman that I failed at. I got fired within a few weeks. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to make a living? What does my career look like? Got a job with a business magazine. Somebody was paying me to write for a living. Business journalists make almost nothing. And so there was this master's program in technical communication at Carnegie Mellon. I was living in Pittsburgh at the time. And I thought, that sounds so fascinating. I could go and be a professional and write and do all this stuff and just get this master's degree, and it would be spectacular. Again, no idea of a research agenda. I'm thinking about a job. But as I get into taking those classes, it's 1989, 1990, 1991, and the big thing at the moment is Apple and Microsoft and new software and new desktop computers and things. And everybody else in that program that I'm with, their dream job is to go to work for IBM, to go to work for Apple, and write these paper manuals that used to be the big thing that came in the box with your floppy disks, or the big thing that came in your box with your desktop computer. Somebody had to make those manuals, and most of the people I went to school with, that was their dream job. They wanted to go work in Cupertino, California with Apple and do the best manuals possible. I would rather chew my limbs off than do computer documentation. But what I discovered is I really liked writing about science. I thought I could work in a research environment as a technical communicator and help with research proposals and grants and reports and all sorts of things. And that would be really fun. I'd get to hang around all of this new stuff. And so during my master's program, I got an internship at the National Institutes of Health in DC, right in the early days of the AIDS epidemic. While I was there, they took the first, actually were able to photograph for the first time the AIDS virus. And so people were still figuring out what that was all about. It was a fascinating time to be there. And I was really enjoying being in that sort of thing. I relocated to North Carolina and wound up working in other research environments for environmental engineering firms and the like, doing those sorts of things. And then a funny thing happened in the economy, which maybe ties back to how I wind up with this. It was in 1991, and there was a little, or 92, 93, a little economic dip. And all of a sudden, in the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, all of the tech firms fired all of their technical writers, hired them back as contractors without benefits. And the less experience you had, the cheaper they could hire you, and the more marketable you actually were. And so the more experienced you were, the harder it was to get a job. I looked around, nobody with gray hair, and I didn't have gray hair at the time, nobody with gray hair was doing what I was professionally trained to do anymore in this little time. It's like, oh crap. What does that mean? And what it meant was that at that time in the profession, technical communicators didn't know how to say, here's my value to the company. And we've spent a lot of time since then working on this. I've been a part of that, trying to help technical communicators and the people educating technical communicators be able to give people, when they go into the workplace, a framework to think about, here's my value, here's my value story, here are the roles I can play, I'm not a secretary, I'm this sort of thing. And so that was the genesis for this line of research there. But anyway, so people are getting laid off. I have a job, although during that time there are periods of unemployment. For me, I go through a couple of different employers, and I think I should go back to graduate school. In graduate school, they never came to me and said, we've got $600 left in the budget. Could you do a $600 edit on this document before we need to bill $600 more. Could you do a $600 edit on this before we send it out the door? Like, sure. Whatever that means. Do I ignore semicolons? Do I, whatever that means, sure, I can do it for you. But when I was at the university, they said, go do this thing and think hard and do your best. And when it's done, come back and it'll be fantastic. which was different than my kind of workplace experience. So I said, I'll go back to graduate school. So I went to the Duke University Library, and I'm pulling journals and books off the shelf, trying to figure out, well, what that mean to go back and do tech comm stuff. And I found this article, the Herndl-Finnell-Miller article on the Challenger disaster. And I thought, this is really cool. Somebody is going into a technical environment where there's this disaster, and they're saying, here are a set of tech comm and rhetorical skills, tools, schema, to be able to read off that disaster, some strategies that would improve science and improve our understanding and make the space program more survivable in the future. If that's what it could mean to go back and do a PhD, I'd like to do that. And so I applied to a lot of places, and actually wound up, when I was visiting schools, I wound up in Carl Herndl of Herndl, Finnell and Miller. At New Mexico State, I wound up in his office. And after talking to him for a few minutes, it's like, oh, you're the one that wrote this article that sent me back here. And it's like, well, I guess I'm moving to the desert. I guess I'm coming out here. I'm gonna try and convince Carl to work with me, with no idea what that really meant, other than that he had written this article, which was really a departure from other things, his other scholarly project. But that kind of put me on a trajectory. Being Carl Herndl's student put me on a trajectory towards a couple of other issues here. When I started graduate school, my wife at the time was a statistician. I thought, I'm going to write about math. I'm going to write about how math works as an argument. And when I go back, when I am rereading some things with my current graduate students, my current graduate classes, things that I was also reading in graduate school, I see marginal comments where I just have a little line and I put math, exclamation point. I had no idea what the relationship was, but at the time, everything was going to tie back to this math-based agenda that was going to. But that kind of fell away, and I got interested in rhetorical invention, where ideas come from. I was going to write a dissertation about that. Carl convinced me that I didn't know anything about rhetorical invention, especially on the poetic side. I didn't have any training in the literary version of invention. So that morphed again. Carl's thing, Carl Herndl's agenda, has been bringing ideas from cultural studies into rhetoric and technical communication. He's been one of the pioneers of that. I didn't know that before I started with him. I didn't know what that meant. But as I took classes with him, it's like, hey, this makes a lot of sense. These ideas make a lot of sense. Okay, so that started to shape my agenda for where I was going forward. And two sorts of ideas came out for me. And what I realize now, looking backwards, as rhetorical scholars, a lot of people are interested in a particular topic area. So they're interested in domestic violence, rhetoric associated with domestic violence or something like that, or particular types of engineers. Carl had a set of ideas that he was interested in, a set of concepts, and over the courses of his career, he's pointed them at different things. And so he has had an idea-based scholarly agenda as opposed to a topic or a method-based scholarly agenda. And so I sort of inherited that. Carl's brilliant, and he writes very quickly, and he can churn that stuff out really quickly. I work a lot more slowly, and so having the luxury of 15 years before tenure, I've managed to stumble around and make that work for me. I'm not sure it's a good approach for everybody on your skills, but that's based on what you're good at. But that's sort of what I inherited, and it's worked out for me good enough. But a couple of ideas started. becoming central to my scholarship. And if you've worked with me in a class before, you always hear me talking about writing problems starting in your stomach. That there's just a discomfort in your stomach when you run into an intellectual project, and there's an exigence that starts in your gastrointestinal tract that you have to, that tells you the direction you need to be going in. And so these are the two things that made my stomach hurt starting back in graduate school. One was this idea of incommensurability, which comes from rhetoric of science. It comes from the philosopher Thomas Kuhn, who in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is famous, and it's where paradigms come from. But there's this, the idea of paradigm suggests that at some point we believed X, and then there was a paradigm shift and we changed the way we understood the world, and now we believe Y. So we used to believe that the Earth was the middle of the universe and everything circulated around it. And at some point we came to believe that the Earth was one thing that circulated around other things that circulated around other things. That is a big shift in all sorts of science when you move from one frame of belief to another. And at some point, absolutely everything is invested in that idea of the Earth-centric cosmos. And it's hard intellectually and methodologically and institutionally and even for religious and cultural reasons to then convince people to move to the next way of thinking about things. You can't just say, no, that's moving that way. We thought it would move this way, but it's actually moving that way. All right, everybody, let's change our minds, right? No, and a lot of things in science are like that. A lot of problems in science. How do you introduce new information and get the community to say, we need to rethink some things? It's a hard problem. But what Kuhn said is that the people who believe the first thing and the people who believe the second thing, during that transition, they can't talk to each other. Language is incommensurable. They have different ideas, they have different everything. They can't communicate at all. And for rhetoricians of science, that's like, well, crap. These people, if you've got two groups and they believe different things, they can't talk to each other. So what do we do now? And so that was kind of an albatross around rhetoricians of science next for 20 or 30 years. And all of the scholarship looked at how communities can't talk to each other. That was the frame we approached things from. Here are two communities, they're doing different things. Well, they can't talk to each other. They can't talk to each other. The other people who study science, the sociologists, the anthropologists, all of the other kind of social science people who study science, just looked at that and said, oh, they can't talk to each other. Okay, what else are they doing? If language is not the lens to look at it, let's look at their practices. Let's look at other things and see how it is that science is still happening. But rhetoricians were wringing their hands, again, with this albatross saying, well, they can't talk to each other, they can't talk to each other. So we had this blockage-based scholarship for 20 or 30 years until we got to a point where we started thinking, well, there are some problems that you just can't throw up your hands and walk away from and say, well, these two communities can't come to a resolution. We have to think about some way of working, either strategies to work past that, or some way to understand that we're wrong about that issue. My dissertation, as kind of part of that, my dissertation looked at a paradigm struggle within the field of statistical science. And I started off thinking, these two people can't talk to each other, so where are the failures? What has failed here? And as I started interviewing people, the statistician said, oh, we haven't failed. We're wildly successful. We're publishing in journals, and we've got professorships, and we're publishing papers in the flagship journals. This is success. You're wrong about that. It's like, great, I'm wrong. So let's flip this idea. Foucault was wrong. You know, I've got a dissertation to write now that has that's going to have some teeth to it. But that gets me to, you know, this kind of long-standing issue is how do communities solve technical problems? After earning my PhD and before I started being a professor, I worked for 8 years at Los Alamos National Laboratory with scientists, with engineers, as a researcher, helping them build collaborative tools and hopefully do better science. And you know, at the national security level, there are lots of problems where you just can't throw up your hands and say, well, the engineers and the physicists just are never going to be able to come to terms like this. It's not, you know, we should just walk away from this nuclear weapons issue and just agree to disagree, right? No, it's like we've got to, there's a bomb somewhere. We're all standing around this bomb, literally or figuratively. And you know, we've got to come up with a way to do that. So I'm interested in how communities solve technical problems, how they come together and find a way to do work, and how the language actually is working. Carl Herndl and I published a paper where we started pulling in concepts from social science, from these other people who had been studying the shared work that scientists do, and say, let's use those to rethink our rhetorical approaches. Let's use concepts that people have been using to describe collaborative successes and see if that can re-inform the way that we think about rhetorical successes in those sorts of things. And I used to say this in terms of I'm interested in how scientists solve problems. But the philosopher of science, Stephen Fuller, has this famous quote where he says, when I pick up a fat-free muffin and I'm reading the label and I'm trying to make some decisions, is this thing going to kill me? Is it healthy for me? What are these chemicals? What do these things on the nutrition label mean? He says, we're doing science. If I'm watching the Discovery Channel and learning about stuff, on some level, I'm doing science, right? So it's not just this rarefied activity in the laboratory that we want to think about, but how do communities make technical decisions? How do we make decisions about genetically modified organisms, or whether we want to release genetically modified mosquitoes to wipe out Zika transmission, or all sorts of things. So I like that broader formulation of that. And this community thing is important to me because along the way, in terms of methods, I have found it useful to use ethnographic methods because a lot of times as technical communicators, as rhetoricians, we wind up looking at documents or texts, which are the end products of a lot of intellectual and cultural activity. And then we say, here's what's going on, and we try to extrapolate back the origins of those strategies, those traces that we're seeing in those end things. Carl and I have been interested in not so much, or not exclusively those end products, but how can we start thinking about being upstream? How can we think about doing analyses that involve being in the room when people are planning, when technical people are planning, or they're solving problems, when they're doing that sort of invention and arrangement? What are the pieces of this problem? What are the relationships between it? Because we have skills as rhetoricians that can be useful in those environments where invention and arrangement is happening, and building narratives and building definitions and all of that. We have things to offer, but the ethnographic methods are the things that you can use in those environments to capture what's going on with language. And often those interviews or those transcripts then can turn into texts that we have tools to deal with as textual people. So those methods have become interesting for me. The other issue that kind of relates to this is an issue of agency, and rhetorical agency goes back and forth between being the most fascinating thing to our discipline and the least fascinating thing to our discipline. Every now and then it flares up and everybody's excited about the idea of agency, and then there are condemnations from famous people saying, I'm done with agency, this is the least interesting thing anybody could be interested in. But it's this idea of, and it relates to cultural studies views of the individual in terms of how the constraints that we're in influence or limit the things that we can do, or shape the things that we can say, or the ways that we can act as agents, as rhetors. And so if I am trying to convince I'm in one scientific community trying to convince another scientific community that idea B isn't better than idea A, for me that's a question of agency. And I've been interested in how that works in technical communities as opposed to some other places. I had to do some work to convince people that agency was something we could talk about, that a set of ideas that have been used in literary theory and politics and all sorts of things, sociology, had a place in thinking about rhetoric of science and how we make arguments there. But so that relates to, how do these people who are solving this problem, how do they stand up and express their ideas? And also how people make unpopular arguments. Because if I'm saying we need to really rethink everything we've invested into this old scientific idea, I've got to be careful about that career-wise, right? Foucault says they're going to light me on fire and throw me out the window because the community is not going to want to hear that. But people succeed. People introduce new scientific ideas all the time, and so that has to happen somewhere. I wrote an interesting article. I think it's interesting. I wrote an article that that came out of a lot of fascination for me with Bush administration torture discourse, which was about how does the president stand up in a specific speech and start talking to the American people about, here are a set of things that the United States government has been doing. I'm the leader of the free world. Here are a set of things. And presidential discourse is not something I had ever worked with before, but it was a particular salient moment for me that stood out to be able to talk about that type of agency making an unpopular argument, and it allowed me to come back to a cultural studies theory of articulation that I had written about in my dissertation, and I had never found a good way to talk about in terms of science. And I also I thought that people who'd written about articulation were too esoteric, and I wanted to make it into a textual method. So I'm trying to do a lot in that paper. But I thought articulation was fascinating. It dealt with how people convince you by associating one idea with another idea. Powerful people, we have to cut taxes because these good things will happen if we cut taxes. But anytime that the people writing about it, rhetoricians writing about it, or wrote about it, they would say, make broad topographical metaphors about what was happening. And I thought, well, show me a text. Show me a textual feature that someone is making this sort of association. Don't just talk to me about maps and landscapes. So that's the other thing I was doing in the Bush paper, was trying to make that work too. So I had tried to do it in a scientific context, and I never could work it out. So by stepping out of where I was comfortable, I was trying to push those things forward. A lot of the stuff I've written in terms of educating technical communicators for the workplace, two of those things have dealt with the role of the technical communicator in the workplace. One of them flowed out of a graduate course that I took with Marilyn Cooper on the postmodernism in technical communication, and so tried to think about a certain set of issues of postmodernism right at the end of the 20th century, the way people were writing about that and how that applied to technical communication. And Dr. Wolford and I revisited those ideas in a paper a couple of years ago, because this really cool book came out that instead of postmodernism, it was post-postmodernism. And so it was an opportunity to say, this conversation was going on in TechCom at the turn of the century. 15 years later, there's this new formulation of it. How does that change what's going on? And again, if you've had me in class, what I always say about articles is that every article has a gimmick, right? It's a thing. So that article is, people wrote about this, new idea, how do we update what's a way to think about that? Ta-da, that's an article. You flesh it out, right? When I teach, I have this kind of list of topoi that I think a lot of our articles are based around. There's this old thing, how's this new thing different? And I think that the 3 or 4 or 5 things that I've written in this, a lot of times come out of a kairotic moment where there was a gimmick that was available to me. And I thought, oh, if I bump these things together, can I say something interesting about that? Hey, what do you know? I've written 5 articles about pedagogy now. That's how it goes. So where are we going with this? So a lot of this has dealt, and I'm a little over 30 minutes, so I want to try and wrap up here. So a lot of this has been the product of the fact that I had a particular dissertation advisor. And the way things were structured at New Mexico State while I was taking classes, I had a class from Carl every semester. And so he really shaped my thinking. And we get along well, so I liked him. I didn't hate him by the end of that. And we've continued to write together, and we're friends still. But the shape of how can these sets of cultural studies theories that come a lot from literary theory and social theory, how does that shape the way we can think about rhetoric and technical communication? And that filters into these sorts of things. And now I'm writing about rhetoric of photography, which again comes from a couple of issues that have been making my stomach hurt. One of which I've been carrying around notes on for 10 years, trying to figure out how it was going to turn into an article. But what this then becomes about is, and I'm looking at war photography specifically at the moment, I formulated this in terms of when we have war photography, how do we look at the things that are depicted in the photograph and then generate narratives and tell stories about what's going on? And if you saw my May seminar talk for the last year, maybe the year before that, I've been talking about this for a couple of years. But how do we look at the things depicted, the networks of things depicted? How do those networks work together to allow us to make narratives about what's going on? And which gives us a chance, or gives me a chance to start writing about a lot of the materialist rhetoric, the new materialism that's become very popular in rhetorical studies and is creeping into the way we think about technical communication as well. But that involves me kind of retooling. That involves me thinking about what new theories can I bring in, or are there opportunities to bring in to think about these sorts of things. And I'm not sure that this ties directly to any of my previous questions, but it still picks up on things that I've been kind of fascinated with as a sideline for a while. But I think that if you're publishing today, being able to point at that conversation about new materialism is more fruitful than me still exclusively talking about cultural studies. Because the cultural turn people are less fascinated with. The material turn is the thing that's the kind of the hot currency at the moment. And so I'm trying to, like the old, in the late 70s, the old rock stars that all of a sudden were putting out disco hits, trying to stay current. This is my disco hit here. But I'm trying to incorporate new ideas into the way that I'm thinking about my scholarship. So a lot of reading I have to do about that. Okay, so I think I'm done. Are there questions, or what can I do for you now?
I have a few questions actually, and it's mostly because a lot of the stuff that you're talking about that you had done with incommensurability and like rhetoric of science type stuff is sort of where I'm starting right now, or whatever, for my big dissertation project. The thing I want to ask about this rhetoric photography thing is, since you've been doing this for such a long time, and I've noticed this, I mean, not like, but are you gonna, I see a lot of people who either do one of two things, I feel like, in scholarship, which is, one, they stick with the same thing that they've been working with their entire scholarly career, which could be, if it's successful to some extent, 20, 30 years, maybe make a big, a medium to big article that they write on for a while, and then they keep with it, or they do what it seems like you're doing, which is sort of retooling and getting with, you said, like the hot currency. Is that something, as like, if we're going into academia, we have to sort of like try to be on the cusp of like what the currency is? I mean, we should, right? But
as a graduate student, the advice I often give to graduate students is to think, while they're formulating their dissertation, what are 3 journals that are going to publish my work?
Sure.
So can I formulate a dissertation that I can think of, here's some things that are going to break out into easy articles for specific venues, but also is the larger research agenda that I'm gathering data on and reading about, do those things fit into conversations that specific journals in my field are going to work on? I have published in Journal of Technical Writing and Communication, Journal of Business and Technical Communication, Enculturation, and some other place. And those are my journals that make sense to me, that I make sense to them. I am never going to publish anything in RSQ. Mm-hmm. I'm never going to publish anything in written communication. The stuff I do just is not a part of that conversation. And so if you can think about that, and as you come out, if you're doing the thing that I didn't do, which is have that 6-year dash towards tenure, you're going to have a narrower focus. I was talking to David Coffer once, who at the time was department chair at Carnegie Mellon, and he said, new professors, I help them build a tenure machine. And I say, here's your dissertation. You're going to publish very, very narrowly on that for the next 6 or 8 years, and be the guy or the girl, or I'm sorry, the man or the woman, the person who's an expert on that. And people will say, your scope is far too narrow. And you will say, I'm going to get tenure, which is a thing. I have wandered around all over the place. Again, part of Carl's idea of ideas guiding what you're doing. And I've had a career where I've been in and out of academia, so I didn't necessarily have a tight clock that I was working with, so I could wander around and say, oh, that's fascinating. I want to write about that. And now I'm old, and I don't have the terror slash energy slash enthusiasm that a person coming right out of their PhD program, like a shot out of a cannon, into their first job is saying, publish, publish, publish. 3 articles this year, woo! You know, at my age, I do what entertains me. And right now, this is what entertains me. But, you know, what I think is, here's a thing, and there's both a kind of an intellectual playfulness and a practicality that goes into the idea of bringing in new materialism into that, which is, if I bring in new materialism, it's more likely to get published.
Sure.
But also, those are some really cool ideas, and people I respect are coming up with some fascinating things. So I want to spend some time looking at that as well. So, but I've had what I do is at the moment is slightly luxurious because I've been fired before. I've been laid off. If I don't get tenure, I'm going to get tenure. But real wood. But if it doesn't work out, something else will. Okay. Other questions? Oh, you can ask a question.
I'm curious about you're saying that you sort of fell into the question of methods and found something in ethnography that works for you. It's something I've been thinking about. I'm curious as to like what is there a particular text that you've been drawn to that helped you bring together rhetorical methods with what we've classically thought of as ethnography as it's in anthropology? Is there kind of a ethnographic methods for rhetorical scholars type textbook out there?
I don't think there is. I mean, so to parse language here. So an ethnography is a research genre. If you're getting an anthropological PhD, you're going to go and spend a year in the jungle eating caterpillars, and come back and write a book length thing, right? And a book length dissertation that is an ethnography. I've never done that. I don't do that. I use ethnographic methods, which is I borrow strength from those types of approaches, and more so the stance of what is my relationship to this culture, what is the culture, how does knowledge happen, how can I methodologically try to get at an imperfect understanding of that culture. So a lot of that reading comes from the kind of the postmodern or the cultural critique in anthropology that when I was working with Carl as a graduate student, I had kind of a foundation for that, but I don't think there's a book. And I don't think there are exemplars out there of people who've done that kind of work, leveraging these types of methods and stepping into that sort of stance. But I think it's the stance that's important.
I have another question.
Sure.
It's sort of, I guess, it seems to me that a lot of, like what you were talking about with for people who came in late, Greg was talking about his career of getting to where he is now and then having to go up for tenure and like look back on what he's done and sort of like figure out, how he wound up where he is and be able to talk about that to some extent, right, in your tenure dossier. But you talk about your work with Carl being like super formative. One of the things, that I think about all the time as like a graduate student is like mentorship in like these graduate programs. It seems like you found it extremely useful and important. And I feel like a lot of, I don't want to say like successful, there's varying degrees of success, but a lot of people that I see that go out and get jobs usually have like a strong mentorship thing. Do you think that's like super important for grads to have, or can it just be like person to person, case by case?
It's what I want to be able to do for my graduate students. Carl and I wrote papers together while I was in graduate school. We did conference presentations together. He helped me and introduced me to a lot of things. After I graduated, we continued to collaborate. But Carl and I, I talked about that moment where I was in his office for the first time and figured out he had written this article that I loved. And it was just this odd thing that we kind of instantly had this rapport where he could be honest with me and I could be honest with him. And it's not something that your relationship with your dissertation advisor can be one of the greatest dysfunctional relationships in your life, or it can be middle of the road. And I was lucky to have something that developed with Carl and I. And those years, there's a lot of other stuff that went on. But Carl was always very generous in terms of trying to advance what I was doing professionally and continuing to do that. He just wrote a letter for my tenure file. And so I've been lucky with that, but I'm really keen on the idea of creating opportunities for graduate students as best I can going along. But I don't think that that's necessarily, I think a lot of people are successful scholars with all sorts of different relationships with their advisor. What I had worked for me.
I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
I think this is probably for graduate students from any concentration. Well, I may be the only one that's not here. I don't know. But so I would absolutely agree with sort of what you've affirmed, that professional relationship can be supportive beyond just getting you through the PhD in it. And I'm actually very encouraged to see an example of something like that can play out longer term. So I'm wondering, at this stage, how do graduate students go about, in your opinion, cultivating that relationship in a way that is, I guess, proactive and sort of healthy, right? Because I think we can probably all have had the experience of being like, well, I kind of need this from this person, and I know that technically that's kind of what they do for me, but I don't really want to ask, right? Or I don't want to be like, hey, do this for me, and make them feel obligated. So do you have any suggestions for how to sort of navigate that dynamic based on what you've experienced?
Ask.
Okay.
No, I wrote an email to my dissertation supervisor. I need this from you. Please, can we do this?
Well,
You do have that.
Just to clarify, I do this. I just don't feel comfortable.
Well, no, but because as graduate students, we often, we know that professors are busy, right? We see the wrinkles increasing and the creases and all and the hair getting grayer and all of these things. We know that professors are busy, but you should never self-censor. You should never say, well, I need this thing. I need them to read this thing. I'd like to some feedback on this article, or I'd like. I wonder if we could put a panel together for this conference that's coming up. But I don't want to ask because they're busy. Ask, and let the professor sort out. I have time for this. I don't have time for this. That's a great idea, because everybody has good intentions, and you can kind of nudge the good intentions a little bit. But ask and let the other person sort out what they have time to do. It's our job to help you out with things. But there are lots of cracks for things to fall into. And there's always something, there's always the to-do list that's 400 items long. And at any given time, we're making decisions about what are the 20 most important things that we're focused on. And ask and try and get on that top 20. Because I'm guessing that's an easy thing to break into. Yeah.
Dina has a question online. She asked, is there some sort of a protocol for like how you would ask those things? I mean, I guess I have ways that I do it. Yeah, you might have just answered it, Dina. I'm not sure. 100%.
Well, and so what are the So conferences, so two things. That while you're in graduate school, it's important to talk at conferences. It's important to try and publish some things while you're working, but before you go out on the job market, or at least have things. So it's perfectly good to go and sit in any professor's office that you're having a class with, or someone who's a committee chair or something like that, and say, could you help me figure out a strategy to publish some things, to get some things out before I go on the job market, or as I'm working on this thing? Is there a part of this dissertation proposal that I'm talking, that I just submitted, that seems like it would be a good project to kind of squeeze out a quick article about? Or is there something else? Are there, the first thing that Carl and I wrote together, we wrote with another student, a review of a set of books on a particular pedagogical issue that had come out, and so that was a quick and easy thing. But same thing about conferences. Perfectly fine to go and sit in a, if you're in a professor's class and you're writing something, the professor, as Dr. Wolford is teaching 5371 this semester, she's thinking about how can I leverage all of this reading towards something that's useful for me while I'm teaching all of this. How can I make this into a paper? How can I make this into a conference presentation? So if we go and sit in her office and say, I'm having these ideas for my paper, is there an upcoming conference where I could do this thing? And she's thinking, well, I need to do a conference presentation too. All we need is another person who can do a panel. Panels fly better than individual things. So, as Hamilton says, be in the room where it happens, right? But asking these questions, spending time, office hours, I'm really curious about these intellectual issues. I have ambition. I want to do these things. Help me think about how to do that. The professor is thinking about those same things. And if you're in the room where it's happening, they'll say, hey, we should write something together on this. Or I could give you advice on that, or let's do a panel together.
Is it a little more complicated because
it's always more complicated?
Yeah, with online students. It seems like being in the room where it happened it's a good metaphor for like people who are on site, but
you can be in the Zoom where it happens.
Yeah, in the Zoom. Or like Skype conferences and things, right? I don't know if that power distance barrier is larger. I
don't want it to be.
I don't want it to be either. But
I want the online students to be Skyping or Zooming with me during my office hours in the same way.
Yeah.
And I don't want that distance to be a barrier for me playing a role in their intellectual projects.
Sure.
And I think all of the faculty are committed to that.
Sure.
But it's something we have to work at.
Well, I think we are just about out of time here. Thanks everybody for coming out. Thank you to people online. Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for being the first participant in our speaker series. Yay. We can give him a clap. Round of applause. Just wait for it, Luke. I'm thanking everybody. And I'll announce the next one in October. It'll probably be towards the middle after CPTSC, probably. So keep an eye out on the listserv for that.
Are you looking?
All right.